What's up guys, this is Professor Spawn, and in this tutorial we are going to learn about what are variables and how do you define variables in Kotlin programming language. So before we move into variables, let's first refactor this at our project. So just go to the src folder, right click on it, right, and you go to the new tab and click on package. So here we are going to create a package, and we are going to put our code at the respective location. So we are going to click on this package, and we are going to name this as com, and then again click on this com package, right click on it, and just create another package inside com as, I'll name this as Kotlin. And once you do that, com.kotlin, we are going to create one more package named as variables, right? So once you do that, just go to the again to the variables package, click on new, and create Kotlin file or class. So I'm going to name this as variables demo. And once you do that, if you see here closely, you have the package which is named as com.kotlin or variables. So packages are nothing but you create a folders and you place your class files inside those folders, right? So this is basically like an identifier. Let's say that you have class A, and let's say that you have two classes which is of same name. So how does this differentiate between those two classes of two different libraries? It's basically using these packages, right? This is like an location identifier. So let's not waste time. Let's create our function main. So I'm going to create our function main and with no arguments. Remember that in our first program we created function main with the string args, right? But in Kotlin you can also create your function main with no arguments. Even this will work. So here we are going to, as we are going to start with defining a variable, before that we should actually know that what are variables in programming language. Variables are nothing but and rather something in a program that holds your data, right? So your data can be of integer numeric value, it can be of floating values, or it can be character like a b c d, single characters, or it can also hold the sequence of characters which we call it as strings. So in Kotlin, there are two ways to define variables. I'm going to go through all those two ways in this tutorial. The first way is using keyword val, which is val, and the next, after you type val, you need to name your variable. So I'm going to name this as first name, right? Once you do that, just have equals to, and we are going to initialize the first variable using val, which is of type string. So I'm going to name this as spawn. So once you do that, what does this really mean? So to define a variable in Kotlin, the first way is you define the val, name your variable, and assign the value to that variable. So the first name is holding a value of spawn, which is of type string, right? If you are coming from Java, or if you know a little bit of Java, to declare a variable you need to first write the type of the variable and then the name and assign the value. But in Kotlin, even if you don't specify the type, it will still infer the type of the variable. But we can also define variables like last name val with last name, and I can also define the type, and I will name this as, let's say, professor, right? So rather I'm going to switch this. I'm going to have first name as professor and the last name as spawn. So you can do this also, right? You can define your variable, you can declare the type with the colon space, the type of the variable, and you can assign the value. In the similar lines, you can also create an integer variable and you can assign it, let's say 25. You can also declare the floating point integers. So I'm going to declare an variable of interest, and I'm going to name this as 10.0. So remember that there are two ways you can define the decimal points. There is also one way which we can define it using float. So I'm going to name this as compound interest, and I'm going to define it as float. But the fundamental difference between the interest, the variable definition of interest, and this is what if you define a float, you need to have the decimal with a suffix of f. So this will tell Kotlin that this variable compound interest is type of float. Even if you don't define this, it will take this 12f as the type of float. Right? So let's print this. So I'm going to print this. Let's say I'm going to print the first name, and let's run our code. So once you run this code, you will see the output as, whatever variable you have defined, right? In the same way, you can define last name, you can define age, you can, print interest. So I'm going to print this compound interest, and you will see the output as 12.0. So this is the one way of defining a variable. So I'm going to comment this code, defining variables using val, right? What is the other way of defining a variable in Kotlin? And we will also see what is the difference between those two definitions. Another way of defining variable in Kotlin is using keyword var. I'm going to name this as var, and the name of the variable, let's say that, company. And I'm going to have this company as Spawn, right? I'm going to name this as Spawn Corporation. Just a hypothetical name. And I'm going to print this up. I'm going to print this company. And let's run this code. When you run this code, it will do the same thing, right? Print the values assigned to this variable. But then what is the difference between these two variables? Remember that, let's say that you want to change the value assigned to this first name variable to change to some other value. Let's say that I want this first name to have a value of, let's say, John. But you cannot do that, right? If you declare a variable using val, you cannot reassign it. That's the Kotlin compiler will not be happy, and it will give you a compile time error. So if you declare variable using val, this is only read-only variable, right? This is called as read-only variable. Assign ones read-only variables. This is as good as, declaring final in Java, right? This is like a final. You cannot change this no matter what happens. So I'm going to remove this. And if you want your variables to change its value during the code execution, you can, have a variable prefix starting with var, and I can change this. I can change this to, let's say, spawn inc. And you can do that when you define a variable using var. In the similar lines, you can define integers, you can define floats, you can define double, right? So the difference between these two, if you see here, what is double? This is of type, guys, a double. And this is type of int. This is optional. You can have it or you cannot have it. And this is what we call as type inference. So I'm going to again rename this. This is what we call type inference in Kotlin, because it infers the type of the variable without, specifying it explicitly. So this is all about variables in Kotlin, and this is how you define variables in Kotlin. And you should really, if you start with any programming language, you should really see that what are the data types supported by that programming language, and also you should learn that how do you define a variables, because variables forms the most fundamental part of your program. And this is where you are going to store variable. You can manipulate the values, based on your desired operation. So in the next tutorial, we are going to see how does Kotlin handles the null values in variables. So till then, goodbye. See you in next tutorial.